Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll talk a lot about this concept of validation and how we can implement powerful validation rules with a library called FluentValidation. This video is intended actually to be kind of like a getting started guide with this library FluentValidation, but as I always like to do in the videos that I create here, I don't just really want to show you, okay, here's how you use the library, but I want to actually put you in a scenario of a real application that I have started to develop and where I have the need to validate something. Now, it is outside the scope of this video to actually discuss in depth about validation. Where should we do validation? What type of validation we should do in which layer, about validation scopes and other things like that. So if you maybe would like a video on this topic, like more an architectural overview about validation and how do we validate and where do we validate and what do we actually validate at each of the places, then just please let me know in the comments below. That would be awesome. And then we can plan something on that topic. But right now, once again, we want to concentrate on how to actually use this very powerful library called FluentValidation to implement validation in a real application. And before we go any further, I just want to show you that that's actually an application that I have started to work yesterday, and it's a real application. It will be deployed, it will be used. And yeah, it's kind of like an e-shop, I would say. And I have here a very simple domain right now. Like for instance, what we have here is we have aggregates and we have a product aggregate that consists of this product entity and the product image, because we also have this concept of a product that might have actually different type of images. Now, as I always like to do, and if you take a look at my other videos where we have developed a clean API, you would kind of like see that I really like this approach to encapsulate state of my domain classes in the classes themselves, so that they are not editable or not updatable outside the class. That's why what we have here is or are only private setters, and in turn, we expose a rich domain model that would kind of like expose behavior through which we can update the state of the product in this instance. And this has a huge advantage that we can take full control whether we really want to perform a certain update of that product or if we do not want to actually do that. And the reason is, of course, if somebody wants to update or create a brand new product, but with some information that from my business logic is invalid and would put that product on an invalid state, then of course I will not allow that product to even be created or updated. So that's why actually we have here a bunch of different properties like product name, product description, price, available stock, and a restock threshold, and then this product image enumerable through which we actually expose the images that belong to a certain product. And the way that we actually do this, because we have here this private constructor like this private product, is that we actually expose a static factory method that would return, of course, a product, and we call this method build product, and we just receive a string name, a string description, a price, and the restock threshold. That's actually an optional parameter, so we can default it to 0 if the consumer doesn't want actually to provide us a value for that. And then we create the product and then we return the product. So everything is very straightforward. But remember what I have just said earlier. When I create a product or when I update the state of the product, I don't really want that product to be created with an invalid state or updated to an invalid state, because I have a bunch of different other methods that kind of like update the state of the product, like this restock, destock, update price, add product image. Then we have here bulk add product images and change the product name and change the product description. So that's the behavior that we expose right now in what is already or starts to be a rich domain model. Now, the main problem is here that consumers will kind of like want to create a product using this factory method that we have here. And that's why we actually need to validate the input. So before we even create the product and return it to the caller or to the consumers, we want to validate it. And if it's not valid, then we will throw errors or we will throw exceptions. So that's how it will work. But in order to do that, we actually need to implement validation. Now, there would be an option, for instance, to actually go and implement our custom validation engine and things similar to that. But there is really a great and powerful library that we can use, and this library is called FluentValidation. So the first thing that we'll do here is we'll go to the Manage NuGet Packages, and we already have this selected here, which is the FluentValidation, and we kind of like just install that. Let me just click install, and that would install the FluentValidation library. Now, FluentValidation comes in different flavors. There is also a package for dependency injection in ASP.NET Core so that you can perform validation maybe on the model that comes from the controller and things similar to that. But that's kind of like out of the scope of this video right now. We just want to concentrate on the core behavior of this validation with Fluent Validations, and we kind of like have installed this package. Now, the next thing to do is I have already created here 2 folders, and by the way, guys, just want to show you that I have created here some unit tests. And if I click here, run all tests from solution, you would see that I kind of like already created some tests that would cover the scenario where we try to create an invalid product and we would receive different error messages. And of course, that these tests right now fail. And actually the goal of this video, of course, is using validation to actually make this test pass. So it's something kind of like a test-driven design approach right now. Cool. So we already have prepared this validation folder, and I want to actually have subfolder where I have different validators for the different aggregates. And here I have these product validators. And the first thing that I would like to do is create a new class, and I will call this product validator. And that would create for me this product validator. Now, it's very easy to actually use this Fluent Validation library. The only thing that you would need to do is make your validator inherit from abstract validator, and this is a generic, and as a generic type parameter, we have to provide actually the entity that needs to be validated. So in our case, this entity would kind of like be the product. We have to import the missing files here, and we should be good to go. Now, the next thing to do is, or to note, is that when we use Fluent Validation, when we have created this class that inherits the abstract validator, the next thing to do is actually to specify the different rules for your validation, or what does it actually mean for each property to be on a valid state. And in Fluent Validation, this is actually done in the constructor of this class. If you take if you make a comparison, for instance, with AutoMapper, it's kind of like the same principles like AutoMapper profiles, because the profiles for AutoMapper usually also define in the constructor on the profile class. It's the same procedure also here. The rules for the validation you have to actually specify in the constructor of the product validator or of the validator class itself. Cool. Now, to really not stay here very long and type a lot of things, I have already prepared here some validation rules for my product validator that I will paste here, and I will actually get through them one by one. So first of all, you have to specify with Fluent Validation rules. And you specify a rule using this rule for that actually takes an action in which you specify, okay, now I really want to apply a validation rule for a certain property of my product. And therefore, I say here for the first one that I want to actually apply a rule for the available stock. And the reason for this is that the available stock, it should never actually be less than 0. So it should be greater than or equal to 0. Now, Fluent Validation comes with a lot of really built-in validator functions that you can use. Of course, you can also use your custom validators, and we will see just maybe in a second also how you can do that. But you can simply use a lot of default rules that will actually make your life very easy. And then we also have or want to have a rule for the product description. And here the cool thing about Fluent Validation is that you can even concatenate different rules. Like for the first example, we just said that, okay, I want the available stock to be greater than or equal to 0. But for the product description, I say, hey, I want it to be not null, but I also want it to not be empty. So if I have a product, then in my application, I really want to have also a viable description. Of course, here we could even add things like length, for instance, if I said that a minimum length. Let's see here. minimum length, for instance, let's say I want to be 500, whatever. But right now, it's really not important to me here to set a minimum length, but I guess you get the idea. You can just simply concatenate different type of rules actually for this property that we are currently actually creating a rule set for. So in this case, we want it to be not null and we want it to be not empty. So we can just remove the one that we have added earlier. And if we go to the next one, I also want to validate the product name. And here I apply kind of like the same concepts like for the product description. So first of all, I don't want it to be null and I don't want it to be empty. And then the next thing that I would do here is I will say that I would also like a rule for the restock threshold. And of course, then the restock thresholds should be also greater than or equal to 0. Conceptually, this restock threshold is a value. And when the quantity of the certain products, I don't know, maybe if I have set this to 10, for instance, if it reaches 10, then probably I will, I don't know, send some message that we actually want to restock this product and bring in some more items in the inventory. And that's why I would like to actually keep track of that. And okay, if I don't want to have this restock functionality, maybe I want to set it to 0. So 0 is already acceptable or is still acceptable. But of course, I really can't set this to a negative value. And then last but not least, I have here a rule for the price. And of course, for the price, I also say that I want it to be greater than 0. Because if I sell a product, I really don't want it to have a price of 0. I want it to be greater than 0, even if it's, I don't know, 1 cent or similar to that. That doesn't really matter, but it really can't be 0. So I want to actually enforce that in my validator. And basically using these very, very simple rules and concatenating the different conditions, you can very powerfully actually specify how a product or describe what the valid state of a product looks like. Now, once you have done that, the next thing that you could do is go back here in the product part. And for instance, I can say here, I can actually do the validation. Now, the thing is that to actually validate or perform a validation, you need to create an instance of that validator. And then there is a method called validate that we actually will look into just in a few seconds. So first of all, let's have here var validator equals new product validator. So I want to create a new product validator. That's it. And once I have done this, I have here a var, and let's call this validation result, and that would be equals to validator dot, and you see here, this is the method validate. Now, the cool thing about, and of course we have to pass in the product that we actually want to validate. Cool. So the thing is that this validate method, if we take a sneak peek into this one, we see that actually it returns a validation result. And the cool thing about this validation result is actually that it has two different things. Let me just have an if here, and let's say if validation result is valid. So first of all, you have a property called is valid, and if this property is true, then it means that the product is valid. If this property is false, it means that the product is not valid. So the thing is that, of course, I can sneak peek into this property and see if it's true or false. But the thing is, in the case that this is actually false, I would also like to maybe know what actually did go wrong with the validation of this product. And in my case, for instance, I would maybe want to throw new, and I have a custom exception for this that I have created, which is this invalid product exception. And to this one, I have to pass in a string. Now, the cool thing is that this validation result, so if we take a look at that, you see that we have an array of validation failures, or a list actually, that contains each of the validation failure that actually occurred while validating the product. And basically what we'll have here, if we go back here, we'll have, I don't know, let's assume that each or really every property of this product is on an invalid state. So we would end up having in that list of errors would have here then a message for this one that actually it is not valid, and the reason why it is not valid, that it is not greater than or equal to 0. We'll have a message for this one, a message for this one, and this one. Now, of course, if only one property actually is not valid, then of course we'll have in that list only one single message. Like for instance, if only this one is actually not valid, then that errors would actually include only one entry that would regard this rule. So it's kind of like very, very nice to put into perspective what exactly did go wrong. However, when I am throwing exceptions, and when I actually want to, I don't know, maybe inform in a very meaningful way the one that consumes my code and probably also my exception, I would also like to send a message. And the cool thing about this validation result is that it has implemented an overload for this toString method that would kind of like concatenate all the messages that you have in the error list. And they use by default a new line as a delimiter. So this means that in the end, your string here will contain actually one line for each validation error that you had during the validation. So this means that I can easily take this and pass this as the message for my invalid product exception. And that would actually be very, very good. And if we run some tests, I guess we already run all tests from solution. I guess some of the tests should already pass right now because we actually want to, or we actually wanted to validate something. And yeah, let's just see. Here is pending. Yeah, of course, you see that some of the tests passed, but some of the tests still failed. And there is really a reason for that. I have also tests for negative or 0 price exception when the price is 0 or less than 0. Cool. Now, I want right now to actually bring into discussion a new and very important point, because in all the tutorials you will see, or even in the documentation, and yeah, probably almost everywhere, you will see that, hey, okay, that's the way to go. That's the way that you actually have to validate. Now, the problem in real projects is that it's never that easy, because let me show you a very practical example why this would be a problem. Because let's say here I do some things that I don't really maybe want to validate, because here I'm throwing directly an exception, here I'm throwing also directly an exception, so that's really not a big deal. But for instance, I have this change product name and change product description methods. Now, the thing is that before I actually return the product, or before I even actually want to actually set this new description, I want to validate if that new version of the product, or the product on the new state with the change description, is still valid or not. So before I would actually do this assignment, I would create a product and validate that. So it would mean that I would actually have to come back here and, let's say, maybe copy this code here, or pretty much copy it, and reuse it anywhere or in all the other methods where I would actually want to do this validation. And of course, that is not really something that is a best practice when it comes to clean coding and readable code, because that would be clearly a repetition. So we would violate the do not repeat yourself principle. And you know that I'm advocate to always take a critical look and into what code repetition actually means. But even by all definitions and by my definitions and the way that I see things, still this would be a code repetition, because it's exactly the same thing. It would have the exact same reason for change. If you want to change the way that you actually, or the order in which you do the validation, you would have to perform that change everywhere. So one thing that I would like to do usually with my validators is that I would like to actually bring this behavior of validating the product into the validator class itself. So what I would do for that is I will create, and for that I will also have the code, and I'll just reuse that. So this is the constructor. So what I'll do here is I'd just actually expose here a method. We have to import the missing references, and let's take a look about what we do here. So actually we actually expose here a static and a void method. Right now we are just returning void and throwing exception if it's not valid. So I really don't take this exactly as a best practice. Probably would still want to return a bool or something like that. But the idea is, or I just want us to actually grasp the idea on how we can practically actually work with validation using this Fluent validation. And if we take a look here, we already do here one condition. So if the price of the product is less than or equal to 0, we throw this exception, and then we create the validator, and then we validate. And what we do here is actually if the validation result is not valid, so if it's false, we directly return this invalid product exception with the validation to string. So what we can do here right now is actually right now we can come here and replace all this code, and the only thing that we would actually need to do here is have this product validator. And on the product validator, we have this validate product, and we provide a product that needs to be validated. So if it throws an exception like that it is not valid from the reasons that we actually have defined there, then we will actually rethrow or effectively rethrow this exception right away. And that's why we actually don't do anything like that. So right now, if I go to the tests and if I run all tests from solution once again, this time I would highly expect that all the tests should actually pass, because right now we are returning or we are throwing exceptions when the product is not on a valid state. And just like this right now, if I go to my product and if I actually want to do a validation here, then the only thing that we would actually need to do is, well, simply take or use the product validator and the static method for that validate product, and we can just validate it. So yeah, now that would actually be it. I can just reuse the same method. I just don't have to repeat the code once again and all the logic for how we actually want to validate. And also right now the logic about or actually the logic that is related to how this Fluent validation library actually works is not something that my domain class right now knows about. Previously, when I had here that validator validate, actually that was knowledge about an external DLL. And that's actually not optimal. So basically we achieved two things. First of all, we made our code cleaner. We don't repeat ourselves. But then secondly, right now our product class doesn't really have any knowledge about the fact that we actually use Fluent validation. Because theoretically we could just switch the library or implement our custom libraries or custom validation. As long as we have this validate product model, we can change here whatever we want to do, use whatever library we want to use. It would actually work the same, and it should not break anything else. So that's the second thing. Now, right now there is actually one other thing that I would like to do with you, well, I would like to actually create a new validator here. And the new validator, for instance, and this one actually be a very, very simple one, because I just want you to show a nice concept here in Fluent validation that might come in very, very handy to you. So let's take a look. Let's create here. We have seen that we have this class, a product image. So let's have here a product image validator, but also let's spell it correctly. Validator, that should be it. And once again, what we do here is we inherit the abstract validator, and the generic type param is product image in this case. And as we said, we just need the constructor. And here in this constructor, we will set just one rule. So we have this rule 4, and let's say we have a product image. So let's call this PI, and let's say PI product. Let's just take this product file name, and let's say that it should not be null and it should not be empty. So it's a very, very easy and simple validation that we want to do. Now, the reason that I wanted to show you this, because this is really a scenario that I have encountered in really each type of validation. The first time that you ever have to work with it, you surely will have to actually also implement something like that. And it's harder to find the documentation on how to really do that. So the idea is that if we take a look in the product right now, okay, so we take a look in the product, we see that we have kind of like this this I collection or this I enumerable of product image, which we know that is implemented as a list. So the idea is that we have a list of images, but the image itself, which is a product image, which is a class, has its own validation. So theoretically, when I want to validate the state of the product, I would also like to take into consideration that the product images are valid if there are any. Because as we have right now with the create method, we don't really create anything or we don't add any product image, so it will be an empty list. But we might have cases when we have already a product in our application that has already product images, so we would still have this enumerable and the list here will be populated with something. So in that case, if we want to validate a product, we also want to validate each product image that we have actually there. Cool. Now, let's go here back to the product validator and let's take a look at how we can actually do this. So actually, that's very simple. So first of all, the way that we have this rule for, you already see we have this rule for each. This means that, okay, if I have a collection, I would like to run a validation on each element of this collection. So in this case, I have here the product and I have the product images. So it means that for each of the product images, I actually want to validate them. But how will I instruct here right now this product validator to validate the product images with their own validator? And the cool thing here is that we have a method which is called setValidator. And in this setValidator, we can simply instantiate a new product image validator. And right now, actually, it knows that it has actually to validate also the product images using the validation rules that we have defined in the product image validator. Now, the only thing is, of course, we don't want to really run this validation if there are no elements in that list. So in that case, and that's really very nice and powerful in Fluent validation, is actually that we can provide conditions. So we say that, okay, we want to have a rule for each element in this collection or in this enumerable in this case. And for each element, I want to use this validator. However, I want to do this only when, for instance, and here I can specify a condition. And I say that I want to actually do this only when the product images count, or sorry, let's use any. It's easier. So what this actually does, it sets a condition for the validation. So if we have an empty list with 0 object, then this validation will actually not be performed. If we have any item in this enumerable, then the validation will be performed using this setValidator and using this product image validator. And this is how you can actually validate more complex properties or subclasses by specifying exactly what validator to use and the conditions in which we want to actually perform that validation. And that this thing really helps us very much, because you can build very powerful validation rules and validation rule sets that will be applied on our entity each time we actually perform a validation. And right now we'll see that actually this doesn't really change anything. If we run the unit test again, everything should be theoretically fine. So let's wait just a few seconds and let's take a look at the result of our tests. And as we see, everything is still green, so we are really happy. Guys, I guess that's it for this video. I hope it was interesting for you. I hope it was a content that might be useful for you, because believe me, validation is something that's really important. And from what I have seen and from my experience, validation is something that a lot of projects or teams tend to forget or tend to actually well, not implement properly. But validation is really important, because that's actually how you can easily or make an application or make systems that have less bugs, because you always control the state of the classes or of the entities that your application is actually working with. So that's highly important. And the Fluent validation library is, from my experience, really a very powerful and easy to use way to perform really complex validation. And that's the way that you can actually get started with that. If you have any questions, or if you think that you might want to have, I don't know, maybe a deeper look into different aspects of Fluent validation, please just let me know in the comments. That would be highly appreciated. And of course, if you think that you might have friends or peers that might benefit from this content, don't be shy and distribute it through email, through your social networks, maybe on forums, wherever you see fit. And if there are people that find this helpful, they will be surely be thankful to you. And I myself would be totally grateful if you could do that. This being said, once again, thank you very much for watching. And until the next time, I wish you the very best.